Hi everyone, Carter Krishnaiyer here for the Florida Squeeze. Today, Airbus sells more commercial jetliners than any company in the world. And you have U.S. airlines like Spirit, based here in Florida, based in the Fort Lauderdale area, that have an all Airbus fleet. Frontier, based in Denver, all Airbus fleet. JetBlue, working towards an all Airbus fleet, although should put a caveat on that some some of their Airbuses are the A220, which are actually manufactured by Airbus of Canada. The A320s are Airbus Industry, whose main factory is in Toulouse. But at one time, Airbus was about to go under, and they had not sold a single plane to a U.S. aircraft manufacturer. This plane, the A300, this is a Pan Am model. Pan Am is not the airline that first bought the Airbus, U.S. airline that first bought the Airbus, although they are the second U.S. airline and also had huge operations in Florida. But the first airline was Eastern, and they were headed by Frank Borman, who was the first astronaut to complete, was the commander of Apollo 8, who completed the lunar orbit in Apollo 8. And Airbus launched the A300 series in the early 1970s. It was a consortium of different aircraft manufacturers from Europe, from France, from Germany, even Sweden, Denmark. The wings of every Airbus plane have been built in Britain. So a consortium, right? And this came off of Britain and France successfully building the Concorde. At the time, the commercial aviation market was completely dominated by American manufacturers. Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Douglas Corporation, which then merged with McDonnell, became McDonnell Douglas, and Lockheed, although Lockheed would pull out of the commercial aviation market in the 1980s. Airbus was Airbus 300, their first plane, which seated 300 people. Airbus, it could be called in French, right? Airbus in English. That's why I think they picked the name, because it worked in both languages. Was only sold to some European carriers and didn't have much success. I think they sold a few to Turkish Airlines. They flew a few to Indian Airlines, which at the time was a state-owned carrier in India, a domestic carrier. But they did not have any success widespread, other than the obligatory airlines in Western Europe buying the airplane, because it was a consortium of those governments and those manufacturers in those countries. 1975 comes along, Airbus stopped selling planes completely. They do not have anything on their order book from about the middle of 1975 to the middle of 1979, which is when Frank Borman becomes part of the story. Eastern Airlines was having to modernize its fleet at the time. Eastern was one of the two largest airlines in the free world, or one of the two largest non-state-owned carriers, one of the two largest privately owned carriers in the world, along with United. They went back and forth for many years, Eastern and United. And what happened in 1977 was Eastern was having to modernize its fleet, because this is a long story, maybe for another video or for another channel. It's not as, although it is still kind of Florida-centric, so we'll do it. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who had been the decorated chairman of Eastern Airlines, didn't believe in jet technology. So Eastern, of the major U.S. carriers, there was a big four U.S. carriers at the time, which were American, United, Eastern, TWA. And then there was a smaller group of more kind of regionalized carriers, which included Delta and Continental and Northwest, who would become major carriers, major players, in addition to many other carriers. And then Pan Am was the big international carrier. They all went towards jet engines. Eddie Rickenbacker still believed in prop, thought turboprops were the way, and even some piston engine planes. So Eastern was behind in modernizing their fleet, and Frank Borman was very conscientious of how Eastern's fleet was gas guzzlers. Were full of gas guzzlers, particularly after the Arab oil embargo of 1973. So Airbus leased him 4 A300s that were just sitting on the lot in Toulouse that no one was buying. Gave them very favorable terms to lease it. Borman was so impressed by the plane, he went ahead and ordered about 25 more for Eastern. And then the A300s became omnipresent in Eastern's Whisperliner fleet. They were two-engine jets, so they were more fuel efficient than the tri-jets that Eastern was flying on longer routes, the 727 and the L-1011, Lockheed L-1011, which was a very good plane, by the way, but got outsold by the DC-10, which was not a good plane. But that's probably a subject for another time. I think that's really one of the unfortunate things that happened in commercial aviation, that the DC-10 so dramatically outsold the L-1011, and Lockheed left the commercial aviation business as a result. The A300 was a two-engine, 300-seat passenger plane, well ahead of its time. Eventually, Boeing would go that direction with the 767, and now obviously has the 777 and the 787 Dreamliners, who are two-engine wide-body planes. And Airbus continued on with the A330, or the A310, which was a derivative of the A300, really the same plane. And then the A330 and the A350, which are the most fashionable wide bodies today. The A350 is sort of the flagship plane of the British Airways fleet, of the Delta Airlines fleet, of the Qatar Airways fleet now, and several other airlines. And then this two-engine wide-body concept eventually becomes really fashionable because ETOPS is allowed. Previously, you could only fly with a two-engine plane 60 minutes away from an airport, so you couldn't fly out over water. Once ETOPS happened, this was great for Eastern because the A300 could fly routes from New York and Miami to the Caribbean. And they stuck them on some shorter routes too within the U.S., routes like Miami, New York, Boston, Atlanta got A300s, but even Fort Lauderdale, Nassau got A300s for a little while, right? It's a really short route, but it's an international route. So Eastern orders the Airbus A300, and then the A300 starts selling again. And then what was seen as a vice by U.S. carriers, don't buy non-American built planes, kind of goes away. Pan Am, as we mentioned, as I demonstrated, ordered the A300. They also ordered the A310. Continental eventually orders the A300. American eventually orders the A300. But still, Airbus has difficulty in the U.S. market, really, until United and Northwest order Airbus narrow-body planes in the early 90s, and then U.S. Airways goes all in on Airbus planes. It basically makes their entire fleet Airbus by the time they merge into American. And as I said at the outset of this video, you now have JetBlue, which has massive Florida operations, Frontier that has pretty big Florida operations, and Spirit that's actually based in Florida, that have entirely Airbus fleets, or JetBlue will soon, as they phase out their Embraer planes and replace them with A220s, which, as I said, is not, it's a subsidiary of Airbus that builds that, which is based in Quebec, Airbus of Canada, but it's still an Airbus plane. It's not a Boeing plane. So just a little brief video on how Eastern, which was based in Miami, and who was so instrumental in Florida air traffic and air travel, saved the Airbus consortium. Airbus would have gone out of business if that sale to Eastern hadn't been made. And the floodgates opened after that for not only the A300, but for Airbus to develop new derivatives, the A310, and then develop clean sheet new planes. A320, A330, A340, and A380 were four-engine planes that have not done well. But two-engine planes, the narrow-body A320 family, which includes the A319 and the A321 as well. The A330 series, which now has the A330 Neo. You might have flown one of those if you've flown Delta transatlantic. Delta really is the big customer for the A330 in terms of transcontinental. It hasn't done as well, the Neo, as the original A330, and then the A350, which, like I said, is a flagship plane of so many airlines. And Frank Borman sat in Miami in Eastern Airlines headquarters and made this fateful decision, which was which was critical to Airbus staying in business. And I should have mentioned earlier, but I will mention it now. The reason why Borman was so impressed by the Airbus A300 is it was quieter and it was more fuel efficient. And the fuel efficiency savings over the L-1011s and the 727s were 25 to 30 to 35% in some cases. And this was at a time when fuel efficiency and miles per gallon, as we call it in the automobile industry, but MPG, was really being thought about by airline executives. And we would have another oil crisis in '79. And Eastern, who were an airline really badly impacted by deregulation, obviously went out of business in 1991, more due to labor trouble than any of these other things that happened. Deregulation of the Carter administration goes into effect in '78. I think they weather that oil shock in '79 and the recession of '80, '81, '82, and don't go out of business the way Braniff did, because they ordered the A300 and because they also ordered Boeing's sort of response, which was the 757, which was a really fuel efficient, energy efficient, long narrow body plane. The A300 and 757s became the flagship planes for Eastern up until their collapse in 1991, which again was more due to labor problems and Frank Lorenzo than anything else, than anything Frank Borman did, for sure.